Okay, good afternoon. So this presentation is the results of Justin Lewin's Master of Science thesis. Justin he defended his thesis a month ago, turned it into the library last week, and then went to Europe on me. So as his academic advisor and colleague in the research, I'm giving the presentation for us. So just to be clear, I want to talk about how hydrology will influence water temperatures and the risk of downstream temperature effects. But, what's heating the stream is the sun. And so sunlight produces heat, that heats the water. And so most of our policies, our regulations are just trying to block that. They're trying to block sunlight, create shade so that you moderate temperatures. But with interest in more riparian restoration, potential land managers wanting to open more canopy along stream channels and so forth, the question becomes what happens to that heat? And so what happens with heat and water is very complicated. There's a lot of different places that heat can be either diluted or it can be dissipated. And so particularly when you start talking about where water enters into stream channels through either subsurface exchange with Hyporheic exchange or groundwater, or if you have tributaries coming in, that can be a very significant dilution method of heat. And so if we start talking about situations where we're removing more canopy, maybe we want to do some riparian restoration, the argument might be, well, you're removing the shade, so you're going to be creating a downstream risk. Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case in all places, and that's what we tried to find out in our study. So here's just a look at some of the hydrologic processes that go on. You have exchange in the stream bed, where water upwells and downwells through the bed. And you also have water that's moving through time. So some of it's heated by sun, sometimes it's going through nighttime periods. And all this mixing happens that ultimately affects your downstream temperatures. So the study occurred in Scotts Creek, which is just north of Santa Cruz. The majority of where we studied was on the Swan Pacific Ranch owned by Cal Poly. Our Scotts Creek reach was actually on Big Creek Lumber's property. And so the Scott Creek reach was a low gradient pool ripple stream, stream gradient less than 1%. Watershed area was about 3,600 acres. And Little Creek, in contrast, was a very steep channel. So gradients about 4 to 10%. You had step pool, cascade morphology, and only about 800 acres in area. And so over the period of 2 years, we studied for 5-day periods the stream temperatures in each of those reaches. For temperature, we used a fiber optic cable with a technology called distributive temperature sensing. That's Justin, by the way. And so what the fiber optic cable gives you is it gives you very accurate temporal and spatial data on temperature. So we knew the temperature of the water pretty much every second for every meter for those 5 days. And with the hydrology, we injected a rhodamine dye at a steady state concentration, watched that steady state, watched the run out of that dye, and then with the one-dimensional transport model, we can come up with pretty good estimates of how much Hyporheic exchange, how much transient storage, that's water that's staying in pools, what's the resident time of the water, and how much groundwater input's coming in. We collected climate data to give us an idea of what the energy exchanges were from the atmosphere toward the water. And finally, one of our objectives was, okay, this is pretty complicated. Are there some simple measurements that we can make, simple channel measurements that we can make that may actually tell us some of these more complex processes or indicate where we have a risk of downstream temperature effects or not? So here is a summary of one of our reaches. This is Little Creek, and this is from our temperature signals. You can see going 825 meters. So up here over on the left, you have upstream going downstream. And the point of this graph is to show you this is maximum daily temperature. And these are at 25-meter spacings. And at any given 25-meter spacing, you can have a very different range in temperatures in the same time period. You can have a very different temperature from one location to another. So if you think about how many of us monitor stream temperature, we put a temperature probe at the bottom of the stream and call that monitoring. Well, the temperature is really very much driven by your site characteristics. Yes, you have that heat that's moving through the water, but site-specific characteristics is going to have a huge influence on what your temperature is at any given point. Okay, so we put together the various heat elements into a heat budget, and then we used a linear regression model, time series model, to try to figure out what was the most significant influences on the temperature. And of course, net radiation came out as a positive correlation. That's our sunlight. But also what was positive was latent heat exchanges, so that's evaporative condensation and cooling of water. But more importantly, there was a negative correlation with the hyporheic exchange. On Scotts Creek, we only saw that correlation in the upper part of the reach. In 2015, when we measured Scotts Creek, it was a significantly low flow drought year. The residence times we were getting on the lower part of Scotts Creek were on the magnitude of, it was taking about 9 days for the water to move 100 meters. So when you start doing statistics at a 25-meter spacing, it doesn't work out too well at that residence time. But we did see it in the upper reach where the water was moving a little bit more quickly. So hyporheic exchange was influential. So what about the channel measurements? Well, shade. Shade of the sunlight obviously was a significant correlate in both Scotts and Little Creek. In the case of Scotts Creek, though, we can't claim a statistically significant relationship, say at a 95% confidence interval. Again, the long residence times kind of confounded our statistics, but at least there was a weak relationship there that demonstrated that the shading was important. But nothing else really came out. Nothing really came out with the exception on our high gradient stream. The width-to-depth ratio was a good predictor. And it was opposite of what you might think. Usually when we talk about width-to-depth, we talk about adverse effects. You have a really wide stream that has little depth. You have a lot of surface area, little mass. You have a lot of heating. It was the opposite in this high gradient stream. And so what we think is going on is with this higher width-to-depth, you were getting more downwelling of the water. So you had more exchanges with the subsurface water, so it actually would cool the stream in those locations. Okay, so with our heat budget now, we can start asking the questions about, well, what would happen if we put more heat into the system? So we could actually now use it as a model. And so we tried two scenarios. One was removing the canopy by 50%, kind of equating to the minimum forest practice rules WLPZ standards that you might find, and also what would happen if you completely remove the canopy. And this was just done on the first 200 to 300 meters of our water course, of our study reaches, excuse me. And then the other thing that happens when you remove near stream vegetation or remove the forest vegetation is you increase stream flow. And so when you're in low flow conditions, that increased stream flow is going to be coming from the hill slopes. It's going to be groundwater. So in our model, we didn't know how much groundwater increase we would get, so we just decided to test a range of them and see how that might influence the temperatures. And so here's some of our measured data on Little Creek. This is one location, just to illustrate why it's so important with the mixing of the water. You can see our surface water over about a 4-day period has, high max in the afternoon, low temperatures early in the morning. And if you start looking at the hyporheic water, all of a sudden the maximum temperatures aren't as high, the minimums aren't as low, so overall average much lower than the surface water. So if you have that water mixing with surface water, you're going to have dilution of heat. And then we found a little seep in Little Creek where we could actually measure the groundwater temperature, and it was averaging about 14.8 degrees C. No diurnal fluctuations, much cooler than the averages from the other temperatures. So if you're going to increase stream flow, then our hypothesis is that that's going to influence the water temperatures. So in the model, here's just a summary of some of our results. What we have here is average maximum temperature for the 5 days. So this was the current condition for both Scotts and Little Creek. And reducing the canopy on the first 200 to 300 meters on Little Creek gave you, about 1.5 degree change. Not a big difference, interestingly, between 50 and 100% reduction. On Scotts Creek, 2 degree, almost a 2 degree change at 50%, 3 degree at 100%. But with changes in stream flow and increases in groundwater, what the model was saying is that that heat would be very much, would be lowered. The water temperature would be lowered. So ultimately what this was telling us is that if you were to do some sort of restoration and you did have some change in the stream flow and you also had these hydrologic characteristics going on, then potentially you would have a much lower risk of downstream temperature effects. So just some of the conclusions. We found a strong influence with solar radiation, latent heat, and the hydrologic exchanges and Hyporheic exchange. As far as physical measurements, stream shading was a good correlate, and with the depth ratio in our high gradient stream. And from our model, I think what we demonstrated was that if you take into account the hydrology of the stream, it can actually be a very useful indicator of predicting what might be a downstream risk from potentially opening up the canopy and watershed. Okay, so I can't leave you with just that, though. These were 2 streams. This really needs to happen over on a larger land base. So this needs to be looked at in different climates, and I would think different morphologies of stream channels to attempt to see if we could come up with some simple physical measurements. I still believe that that's something that could be possible, depending on your geology and the morphology of your stream channels. And of course, what I'm hoping will happen, the idea is that on these reaches, we're going to go to CAL FIRE and maybe talk about actually doing some riparian manipulation, and then we can see if we can validate those results. Thanks for your time.
So I noticed in a number of your slides there's a pretty significant bedrock presence. And so I wonder if your high width to depth ratio stream maybe had degradation and therefore the bed material was more permeable and able to exchange more hyporheically.
So there was bedrock. It actually was not as much of the study reaches as you might think. There were locations of it. But yes, absolutely. So at the top of these cascade features, oftentimes you had a piece of wood with aggradation and gravel, and so you would get the downwelling. Definitely.
I know you had limitations with just the 2 creeks. One was Little Creek, one was Scott. What was the difference in CFS?
Oh, so in low flow situations, oh gosh, I think we were down around 2 to 3/10 CFS on Scotts Creek. So very low on Little Creek, probably about 1/10 of a CFS.
And these were year-round, not thermal?
They are not thermal. They are year-round, though. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you had, in your model, you had the solar inputs warming, right, as the canopy was reduced. But you also had the groundwater as a mitigating factor. Have you looked at all, or did your students look at all, at the amount that groundwater is needed when the canopy is removed from the upper slopes?
No.
I got one, Chris. The canopy, the shading was measured with a solar pathfinder, is that right?
That's correct. It was, I used the term shade, but really what we were measuring was how much of the solar insolation was blocked. So it was a proportion of the incoming net radiation. So a solar pathfinder, yes.
But you are going to be looking at hemispherical photography in the future as well, is that right? I guess Brian's going to.
Sorry, I'm not, no, but there may be some of that work going on.
Brian's going to be buying it.
Okay, excellent.
Any more questions? Chris, I think there's been some work in Oregon that showed as with clear cuts, you can warm the summer groundwater because of the surface heating as the water's entering the surface. Is there any thought of that affecting your temperature input in your design?
I think that was the nature of the previous question as well. Absolutely. I mean, whatever temperature of the water that's coming in, that's going to influence how much heat is diluted. I guess maybe I could say an anecdotal story to that is I worked on this same problem in Hinkle Creek up in the Cascades of Oregon. And in Oregon, on their non-fish-bearing small streams, they don't have to leave any canopy. So from a research perspective, we had the opportunity to look at a lot of heat. And there were times when, after a clear cut in Hinkle Creek, the water temperature decreased following the harvest because of the input of groundwater. So even if, I mean, we did not measure the groundwater change in the stream, or excuse me, in the hill slopes. So even if that did occur in that situation, the water temperature was actually decreased following harvesting because of the inputs of groundwater.
Any more questions for Chris? One of the things I've been trying to wrap my head around is whether the stream would cool back down, whether once it went back into shaded reach, or stay at the hot temperature it was at. Do you have any thoughts on that, or do you see anything in your data?
All right, so thermodynamics would tell us no, it would not cool. You know, heat cannot disappear. You know, it only can be transferred, energy can only be transferred. But the reality of most of our measurements is that when you see something go into a shaded reach, obviously the temperatures do go down. And certainly with the distributive temperature sensing, we're seeing such a change in temperature over a longitudinal profile, and that's correlated to the shading. You know, I don't want to be saying that it cools because it's probably not completely true, but certainly there's mechanisms there that lower the temperature.
There was one big outlier on your temperature graph profile that you had. Did you talk about that it was way up there, like 18?
Yeah, that was way up there, and that's just, you know, part of the variability. In that particular location, we just had a lot of sunlight coming in. Yep. Interestingly, 25 meters away, it was right back to the sort of temperature from 50 meters prior.
Anything else? Chris, did you look at metrics other than max daily temp, such as MWMT or the other?
No, because this is really more, I mean, our objectives were more to measure and correlate the processes. So we weren't trying to relate any, I mean, in a 5-day period, we couldn't do an MWAT really. So that was not the objective of the research.
I think we're going to cut it off there. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.